Hello, and welcome to this webinar on displacement in Afghanistan. What should the international community do? I'm Fen Hampson, President of the World Refugee and Migration Council, and pleased to moderate this event. With the return to power of the Taliban following the withdrawal of American and allied troops from Afghanistan, the people of Afghanistan confront massive challenges. Many are fleeing the country in the hopes of finding sanctuary and a new life elsewhere. Neighboring countries are struggling to deal with a major influx of Afghan refugees. Humanitarian organizations face new risks and funding shortfalls as they struggle to feed, house, and clothe Afghans who've been forcibly displaced both inside and outside the country. Afghans are imperiled, not just by the Taliban, but by famine, a collapsed economy, the withdrawal of development aid, which funded government services in 90% of the country's hospitals, the health risks of COVID, the absence of vaccines. The rights and lives of women, children, and Afghanistan's minorities are at grave risk. There is some good news, though. The United Nations Secretary General announced yesterday that the UN has received $1 billion in donor pledges to help the Afghan people, though the United States and its allies say that money cannot go to the Taliban government, which they refuse to recognize. Our distinguished panel of Afghanistan civil society and regional experts will shed light on this evolving situation and how countries in the region and the international community should respond to this evolving crisis. The World Refugee and Migration Council is pleased to co-host this event with the United States Institute of Peace in Washington and the University of Ottawa's Center for International Policy Studies. Our discussion is going to focus on three main issues. What is the situation on the ground in Afghanistan? How should the international community deal with the Taliban to safely evacuate those who wish to leave the country while providing humanitarian assistance to those who remain? What migration pathways are available to those who are trying to leave? What concrete action should be taken to resettle Afghan refugees and increase the resources available to humanitarian organizations that are operating at the front lines in this crisis? Before turning to introduce the panel, let me ask Scott Warden, who directs the Afghanistan project at the United States Institute of Peace, and Rita Abramson of the University of Ottawa's Center for International Policy Studies, which she runs, to say a few words of welcome. Over to you, Scott.
Thank you, Fen, and good morning, everyone. I am the director of the Afghanistan program for USIP, which is a congressionally funded, nonpartisan, independent institute that is dedicated to preventing, mitigating, and resolving violent conflict. We've had an Afghanistan program since 2002 and an office in Afghanistan since 2008. So this work demonstrates the difficulty of achieving that mission. We were very fortunate to be able to evacuate our immediate staff from our Kabul office. We've suspended operations there. But so many of our partners and other Afghans that have fought for human rights gains, for civil society gains, are left behind and are trying to get out. So this really puts a personal face on the overall issue that we're under discussion today. I'm sure that you'll hear more from the panelists about this in detail, but I just want to underscore that there really is a complex challenge of not just getting people who want to leave out of Afghanistan, but ensuring that neighboring countries provide a pathway for them to move to other countries that will receive them. So this whole process is obviously taken in an emergency situation, but it requires diplomatic intervention. And I hope that both the US, our NATO allies, and the region will work together to solve this problem. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Scott. And Rita, can you say a few words of welcome?
Good morning, everyone. Thank you, Fen. I would like to Good morning. Thank you, Fen. On behalf of the Center for International Policy Studies at the University of Ottawa, I'm pleased to join you, and I'm very pleased to welcome everyone to this important event and this very important discussion. The Center for International Policy Studies, or CIPS as we call it for short, is a research center with a twofold mission. First, we do research on international security and global governance, and then we have a mission to promote public debate and knowledge about international affairs and Canada's place in the world. And from that, you can tell that the current situation in Afghanistan is very close to our mission and very close to our hearts. In fact, when the center was launched back in 2008, our very first event was a conference on Afghanistan. And that came at the end of a year when violence had reached a record level in confrontations between the West and the Taliban. And our question back then was, can a sustainable outcome be achieved? And I think it's sombering that that's still so many years later, a pertinent and relevant question. So on behalf of CIPS, I would like to say thank you to the organizers. We're pleased to be part of hosting this event. I very much look forward to discussion, and welcome to everyone. Back to you, Fen.
Thank you very much, Rita. Let me now introduce our panelists. Their full bios are on the program website, so my introduction is going to be brief. We're joined by Belkis Ahmadi, who is the Senior Program Officer of the Afghanistan Program of the United States Institute of Peace. Nipa Banerjee, who is Senior Fellow and Professor in the School of International Development and Global Studies at the University of Ottawa, and for many years ran the aid programs of the Canadian International Development Agency in Afghanistan. Fawzia Kufi, who is the former Deputy Speaker of the Afghan Parliament and head of the Women's Affairs Commission. Eileen McCarthy, Advocacy Manager with the Norwegian Refugee Council. Alp Ozerdem, who is Dean of the Jimmy and Rosalind Carter School for Peace and Conflict Resolution, and for many years conducted development and peace building programs in Afghanistan. Seema Samar, who is the UN Secretary General's high-level panel on internal displacement, and the former Afghanistan State Minister for Human Rights and International Affairs. Najiba Wazifadost, who's an Afghan refugee based in Sydney, Australia, who is co-founder of the Asia-Pacific Network of Refugees and the Global Independent Refugee Women's Leaders Group. Well, let me turn now to our panel. We're going to jump right in to our conversation. And let me begin by asking Fawzia and Belkis, and we'll perhaps start with you, Fawzia. Perhaps you could tell us what the political and human rights situation is right now on the ground in Afghanistan. We hear reports of journalists being arrested and tortured, other stories about Afghan citizens being detained, tortured, and killed, including women, human rights advocates, minority groups, NGO leaders, and members of the former Afghan government. So perhaps we could start with you, Fawzia.
Thank you, Fen. I have difficulty turning my video on because I think the host has put it on mute. So if you could help me with that, it would be great.
Perhaps our technical team can address that. There we go.
Okay, great. Thank you.
We're on now. Thank you.
Okay, no, thank you. I would like to thank you and the World Refugee and Migration Council for organizing this very timely webinar that we need the international community attention more than ever at this time. So it's unfortunate that after each 10 or 20 years, we start from scratch. All my life, unfortunately, has been a victim of internally displacement. I have never dreamed that I will actually leave my country. I'm hoping, although temporarily, but now I'm not in Afghanistan anymore. with me and like me, thousands of other people who had a dream of a better country for themselves and for their children and for the rest of the population were, were left with no option but to flee Afghanistan because of what has happened. So for me to see everything collapsed in front of my eyes and in a very short period of time is something that still mentally, personally, I cannot come over. I've been struggling to process everything that I have seen in Afghanistan. When I started negotiation with Taliban in 2019, and the reason I actually got engaged was because I thought it's very easy always to talk with people that are same-minded, with groups like yourselves and others in this platform, but hard to talk with people like Taliban who are, so different in their views and stance on many issues, including rights and liberties. So when I started negotiation with them in 2019, my hope was that we will be able to influence them and shape their perspective. Their political office was in Qatar, and I was also part of the political, the official negotiation team with Taliban in the past 1 year, again, with the hope that we will come to a political settlement that is acceptable by majority of people in Afghanistan, representative enough to be able to sustain the social fabric of Afghanistan. However, we all know that things did not go the way we expected, many reasons. I don't want to go to the reasons, but I think mainly because of the Taliban's preferred military strategy and the weak governance we had before Taliban. Where we are now is left with a very poor, broken system, a Taliban government that is mainly, or all of them main. Some of them we know are in the sanction list of the UN and also on the wanted list of FBI. My hope was again that they will start working with some women at some level. Their political office started to give statements, however, statement in support of women, but we know that their military, who is much more powerful now and they are controlling things, they do not have that much openness and willingness to engage with women and minorities in terms of inclusion of the society. So their government is basically one-sided. We know it's mainly by people who have actually fought with Taliban, their fighters, their commanders. That led to a lot of uncertainty, not only because of the the risk, the immediate risk people were facing in terms of humiliation, house search, house arrest, which I also undergone personally for 2 weeks or above, another form of arbitrary action, but also extrajudiciary killings, but also the fear of uncertain future. Many people actually either left Afghanistan or planning to leave, taking very dangerous routes, is because of their uncertainty about what will happen to them. And that is because of the weak institution. So therefore, I think we all have a huge, huge task again ahead of us. Afghanistan, we all know that it's traditionally a very, very rich country, billions of dollars underground, let alone the very young and dynamic population, which are potential economic factor that could be used, and also the beauty of the connectivity hub. So there are huge potential for better economic opportunities, which are not utilized and used, and they have been undermined. So therefore, again, we come to a situation where we're dependent on foreign aid. And I think a lot of people argue that, we should not work with the government of Taliban, which I think also the same until we have clear benchmarks shown and practiced by Taliban at different layers, not only in the Kabul city or where it's more of the public focus, but also in the provinces, in the villages, in the rural Afghanistan, for them to really respect some of the clear benchmarks in terms of inclusion, in terms of respecting the liberties and rights of people, because we know it's not a nice situation. The reports, I don't need to go to the details. I'm in contact with people on daily basis, at least tens of people who the main thing they start, or the first thing they start, is the complaint they have of the situation. But I think we have to really reach to the communities, to the people, to the true humanitarian aid, because everyone in Afghanistan almost is dependent on salary. The government was the main source of income for the people because they were receiving salary. The private sector is not very strong, and they were also dependent on foreign aid and humanitarian organizations. So closure of some of these humanitarian organizations also left a lot of people with no salary and no jobs. And therefore, I think we have to really find a way. It's a very narrow line between working with the government of Taliban and supporting them, but also trying to deliver humanitarian aid. I think my appeal would be to reach to the people of Afghanistan, because a crisis not only in terms of internal displacement, where people will go to the cities in the hope of a better future, but also a crisis of migration is on the way. People are taking enormously dangerous routes to get out of Afghanistan. The official borders are closed, but we know that there are unofficial illegal borders that people are taking. So therefore, in order to avoid that, I think we want it or we do not want it. It's a problem that we have to tackle. By closing our borders, by closing our eyes, simply we cannot ignore the problem. So we are the result of wrong politics of some of the world leaders. And of course, much more responsibility goes to the politicians in Afghanistan and the leaders that brought Afghanistan to where we are now. Unfortunate situation, but we all have to put our hands together to reach to the people that need our assistance.
Thank you very much, Fawzia. And perhaps I could now turn to Belkis, who has also just recently returned from Afghanistan to offer her own observations.
Thank you, Finn, and the World Refugee and Migration Council for this timely and important event. To put things into perspective, it's important to review the timeline, milestones, and events that has taken place in the past several months. Hold on.
Belkis, can you put your camera on, please?
Okay, sorry. I had to click on something. So it's important to at some point in the near future to assess how we, the international community, missed the signs, or should I say, turn the blind eye. I'm not going to discuss the events and processes that led to the current situation in Afghanistan. That's a subject for another time and a different platform. But important to see the timeline. 8 months ago, in February, President Biden announced that his administration was reviewing the US-Taliban peace deal to assess if the Taliban was meeting its commitments. 2 months later, in April, President Biden announced the full and unconditional withdrawal of US troops from Afghanistan by September 11, though in reality, that withdrawal took place way before that, the full withdrawal. According to the US-Taliban agreement, that withdrawal was to conclude on May 1st. Furious that the US had delayed the full withdrawal by a few months, the Taliban intensified attacks on civilians, private and public properties, and the security establishments. What has happened since then is an open book, but specifically about the human rights situation. Situation is deeply concerning now, with Taliban searching homes, beating and torturing journalists and protesters, and executing people that are closely tied to the Republic's security, justice, and rule of law establishments. Although people of every province and ethnicity and religious background have faced abuse and repression by the Taliban, I would like to bring attention to the devastating situation in Panjshir, and also the mass killings and forced disappearances in Kandahar, Nangarhar, Herat, and other provinces. Judging by the treatment of almost everyone who is not affiliated with the Taliban, it's very likely that the Taliban will increase its repression over time. They will want to consolidate security and control first, before exacting reprisals. The Taliban are still gathering information on who lives where and who did what in the past regime. There are three categories of concern for human rights going forward. General suppressions of human rights, including barring access of women to equal education, work, freedom of movement, and freedom of expression. Specific targeting of activists and government military officials from the Republic that the Taliban want to take revenge on. Future imprisonment or targeted killings of those who dare to oppose the Taliban regime, even peacefully. The crackdown on journalists and protesters in the past couple of weeks is one example. And unfortunately, there will be more if the international community don't intervene. Thanks, Finn.
Thank you very much. And it's obviously not a very good picture in terms of what's happening in terms of human rights on the ground in Afghanistan. Perhaps I could ask Nipa Banerjee to, tell us what kinds of diplomatic leverage are available to Western governments to pressure the Taliban government to prevent human rights abuses, which clearly are taking place. There's a real gap between the rhetoric of the Taliban and the reality in terms of what's happening on the ground, as we just heard. Nipa.
I will make a brief presentation on the Western powers talking to the Taliban and exerting pressures on them to deliver good governance and human rights. The Taliban and the Western powers gave up an opportunity to talk to the Taliban at the Bonn Conference of 2002, when reconciliation with a defeated, broken, and weak Taliban would have been to the advantage of the Western powers and Afghan people. The Taliban used the 19 years following Bonn to strengthen its insurgency and regain its territorial control over Afghanistan. Not grabbing the opportunity to talk to the Taliban now will isolate the Taliban regime and the innocent Afghans along with it. The isolated Taliban could easily return to the reign of terror of the mid-1990s. The Western powers should engage in diplomatic talks with the Taliban. It should be clearly understood that talking to the Taliban does not imply recognition or legitimization of the Taliban government. The talks are consultations with the current Taliban leadership to discuss conditions, fulfillment of which are to result in more talks and possibilities of recognition of the government at a later date. The purpose of the talks will be to exert pressures on the Taliban for provision of safe passage to the evacuees out of Afghanistan, humanitarian organizations, vital access to deliver humanitarian assistance to the internally displaced people and to people in need of life-saving services, respect for women's rights and human rights, and not reverting to the Taliban regime of the mid-90s. Aid and finances to flow to the civilians who most need it, women, children, and marginalized rural people. However, it is believed that without leverages, it will be difficult to get the Taliban deliver on its commitments. Western powers believe that the Taliban can be pressured into delivering its promises if available levers are applied. What leverage does the West have over the Taliban? The US has frozen multi-billion-dollar reserve in gold and foreign currency of the DA Afghanistan Bank and blocked the Taliban from accessing these resources. Unfreezing of these assets are likely to come with stiff conditions for the Taliban to fulfill its commitments to prevent abuse of human rights. Financial sanctions by the UN and the US that ban Taliban access to dollar transactions impose banking curbs as well. Other Western financial institutions are also avoiding doing business with the Taliban. The US has expressed interest in removing sanctions and granting licenses based on Taliban cooperation. Afghanistan relies on imports for food, fuel, and clothing. It imports wheat, petroleum, and electrical power, but they cannot pay for imports without dollars. The Western powers could condition dollar unfreezing on delivery of moderate policies and the actions by the Taliban. The UN has warned that by mid-2022, 97% of the Afghan population will be under the poverty line. Its economy is shaky. World Bank has frozen the grant funds, so has the US and other Western aid-giving countries. Western powers would make resumption of access to the foreign resources conditional on Taliban's cooperation with the international community. These are only some of the most important leverages that Western powers have over the Taliban in the immediate term. More could be added with passage of time. Thanks, Fen.
Thank you very much, Nipa. And let me turn to Najiba Wazifadost, who has been working with some of Afghanistan's most vulnerable groups, women, girls, the LGBTQ community, communities that have historically faced grievous challenges in Afghanistan, particularly under Taliban rule in the past. And I guess my question to you, Najiba, is, how can the international community monitor and sanction the Taliban's behavior towards these highly vulnerable populations?
Thank you very much, Fen. It is a real honor to be here and speaking along with my other Afghan colleagues. And it was also a great pleasure hearing my previous colleagues speaking around the situation. To be honest, right now, Afghan residents are really living in absolutely fear now. They've been reporting to us about door-to-door searches, as other speakers already mentioned, the targeted killings and the looting in the capital. I do have to say that we are particularly concerned for the safety of women and girls, and as well as other human rights defenders in Afghanistan. I would say that it is the worst security situation ever when we talk about women and girls in the country. They've been actually telling us about how they've lost hope for peace and stability, and how many of them are again fighting themselves as prisoners of their own gender. So again, outspoken women's rights agitators, as well as women politicians, as we have in this panel today, and many other countless women leaders and feminist activists who really have helped, to drag Afghanistan into the 21st century, are really facing the fight of their lives today. We know women are being told to stay home unless they're actually accompanied by a male, or women are being forcibly married off to Taliban fighters. We're hearing of girls being already taken out of schools, and schools are being basically closed for girls. So we worry for the situation for women in Afghanistan, which is really deteriorating rapidly. At the same time, we worry that borders which are closing in response to the pandemic are also preventing Afghan women fleeing violence and persecution from finding safety. We worry again, from other Afghan refugee women who have made it across the borders, who are worrying for the remaining of the family members who they will never see again. And again, I have to say, we worry so much that governments that are turning inwards in their response to the crisis in Afghanistan will ignore the needs and rights of the women and girls who cannot count on the local authorities to protect them at times like this. So speaking to women on the ground through ACNUR, the Asia Pacific Network of Refugees, they've been really describing to us that they're no longer talking about preserving the progress and the rights that they have gained. It's more about, their conversation and their talking is more about the mere survival. So I mean, we've seen so much in the last 2 weeks that we don't need to talk about it. Importantly, and in contradiction to assurance that the Taliban would uphold women's rights, over the past 3 weeks, women have instead been progressively excluded from the public spheres. If you look at the composition of the Taliban's new government right now, we can clearly note the absence of women, and again, its dominance by ethnic Pashtun, which is again not a surprise to many of us. The Taliban have said that women can continue to study in universities, including at postgraduate levels. But we are seeing classrooms which are already gender segregated and very, very similar to back in 1990s. The notorious gender segregation has again came in, and the Islamic dress, the burqa, which has also become a compulsory part of that. So we can already see the practice of the Taliban when we talk about women and girls. Taliban police officials also have been beating Afghan journalists and violently dispersing women's protests. So all of these are indication that there is no, it is not going to be Taliban's practice to talk to women's rights, to allow women to be involved in peace negotiation or anything like that. Afghans facing this coming darkness with a sense of being abandoned by regional and international community. They expect far greater engagement and visible support from international community. The first thing that we really hope is that the international community should not consider the Taliban government as a legitimate government. That's so important for the international community to really look at ways of putting as much pressure as possible on the Taliban to immediately seize the use of force towards and the arbitrary detention, of exercising their rights to peaceful assembly. Afghanistan cannot survive without the foreign help, as we heard from other speakers. And I think the point that goes back to Dr. Seema Samar is quite important, that we need to put conditions to the aid. And that condition should not be, for the Afghan civilians to actually accept Taliban as the government. It should be the other way around. We should ensure that the aid that we are actually going to filter into the country doesn't end up again in the hands of warlords, doesn't end up in the hands of the Taliban. I think these are the least that we're expecting from the international community to do as immediate step. Thank you, Fen.
Thanks very much, Najiba. And I'm pleased to say we're joined by Eileen McCarthy from the Norwegian Refugee Council, who's responsible for their programming in Afghanistan. They've been doing wonderful, wonderful work on the ground and continue to have a presence on the ground. Eileen, maybe you could, tell us a bit about some of the humanitarian support needs that the Afghanistan population is facing right now. There are predictions that the poverty rate is going to go up by 25% because of the contraction of the Afghan economy. We've just heard that there are millions of internally displaced persons as a result of a 20-year-long civil war. What should we be doing as an international community to support the efforts of groups like yourself?
Sure, thanks so much. And thanks again for having me and organizing this event. Recognizing the massive humanitarian needs across the country is something that we can't forget for those Afghans who still remain. Around half of the population is in need of humanitarian assistance, and that we are expecting that will just continue to rise as we are seeing this perfect storm of events. While the conflict has largely died down in many parts of the country, we are still seeing this perfect storm of the ongoing impacts of the COVID-19 pandemic, a drought, and the looming winter that we see. It will have huge impacts on the millions of Afghans who are displaced across the country. Even before the latest escalation earlier this year, we saw around 3 million Afghans displaced, and there's been roughly 635,000 more people displaced this year. And that was along with massive civilian casualties and violence that hit near record levels and displaced people across the country. Now that the situation has changed somewhat, we're also monitoring how those dynamics change and where humanitarian needs really lie in different places across the country, and how we as humanitarian organizations will be able to respond. As we've seen the economy in free fall in recent weeks, people have already taken on massive levels of debt to be able to buy food and pay for healthcare and education in recent months. And that's been exacerbated by the limited livelihoods and jobs that people have had in a complicated economy because of the pandemic. As we have seen, the poverty rate could rise over the coming years. So it's also not a solution that we can find in the short time period, as people are struggling to buy food and feed their families and be able to use the resources that they have to meet their immediate needs. So I think what we have seen and are continuing to call for is a mobilization of humanitarian resources to sustain support, both for the crisis that we've seen in recent weeks and months, but also the situation and the humanitarian needs that have pre-existed the current situation. For organizations like us who are operational on the ground, we are hopeful that we can get some fast-tracked and particularly flexible funding to meet those needs and adapt our programming as it changes. We are aware that some people might want to return to their areas of origin now that the fighting has calmed, and might need the resources to be able to do so, while others will remain in protracted displacement and require safe shelter and blankets and support as the winter months are coming. So for us to be able to adapt in this environment and make sure that we are able to keep our team safe and really make sure that the assistance is reaching those most in need. We're also quite aware that there are ongoing conversations about existing sanctions and counterterrorism restrictions that might apply, and making sure that humanitarian activities are really safeguarded from these regulations and that they uphold international humanitarian law so that we're able to continue operating. And I think within this, we're also seeing how the pausing of development funding and real uncertainty and questions about how additional support will be provided in Afghanistan to pay teachers and keep health clinics open, how if that's not maintained, there would be a worsening in the humanitarian situation. So making sure that this funding is able to effectively and appropriately reach people in need, including via NGOs like ourselves who might be able to actually reach those needs of people on the ground. So I think exploring different mechanisms for how funds, including from international financial institutions, are able to actually meaningfully reach people on the ground is what we need to explore over the coming weeks and months. And I think within this, it's not just money that we need to be able to scale up a response, but also the diplomatic engagement that's required to safeguard humanitarian space and ensure that there's compliance with international law, that civilians are protected, and that we have the space to actually deliver assistance. So there's been lots of conversations about how we can resume our programming across the country, including that we are able to operate in line with humanitarian principles that we have always used as the foundation for our work in Afghanistan. And that includes that we're able to deliver assistance to men, women, boys, and girls, that our teams, both male and female, are able to reach those in need, and that we have full access to be able to deliver assistance across the country for those who really need it. So this respect for humanitarian principles is something that we are continuing to reiterate in our conversations and our negotiations, and the international community also needs to support us in order to actually be able to do this. And I think situating this also within the broader regional dynamics and looking at how the international community can support Afghans regardless of where they are, and make sure that there are those safe spaces across the region.
Thank you, Eileen. And perhaps we can now move to the issue that you just raised, which is what are some of the continuing challenges of getting Afghans who are at risk out of the country? Many are going to neighboring Pakistan and Iran. The numbers are growing. What are the risks that those communities are confronting, and how can we better assist, as you just mentioned, those people and work with local governments and NGOs to ensure that their basic needs are met? And perhaps I'll begin with you, Najiba. I know you've been working very hard to get women leaders and their families out of Afghanistan. And perhaps Belkis, since you've also been doing the same, you could offer your own thoughts after Najiba speaks, and then Eileen, since you raised this issue, we'll come back to you. So we'll start with you, Najiba, then to Belquist, and then to Eileen.
And maybe just some quick reflection in terms of how evacuation has actually moved forward, and then I'll give you a quick answer to that question too. The complete withdrawal of the US presence in Afghanistan, I have to say, after 20 years and more than $2 trillion spent trying to stabilize and securing the country, has left, in its wake countless questions, practical, political, as well as moral, about the future of a Taliban-led Afghanistan. It also has left behind almost 250,000 Afghans with no clear answers about how or whether they'll be able to escape what many fear will be violent Taliban reprisals. We know thousands of Afghans right now fearing persecution by the Taliban, either remaining waiting outside the Kabul's airport or sheltering in their homes, hoping to be evacuated at some times, some days, some months out of Afghanistan. And I do want to reflect a little bit around, again, the evacuation process that took place in the last few weeks. We did see the lack of coordination between the various state forces on the ground, especially when it comes to securing access to the airport and dissemination information on opening or closure, as well as, the lack of transparency on the eligibility criteria for evacuation, including the priority orders that have isolated and delayed the travel, to safety for many human rights defenders. And again, especially I have to say, for women that were traveling with children. And it's quite important for us to actually reflect on some of those processes because, many reported to us about the horrifying stories of going back to provinces to collect passports in order to make asylum claim. And families that were no longer receiving any humanitarian aid on the ground were basically having no access, to any kind of shelter while they were displaced in Kabul. And again, we just heard from our colleagues around the newly displaced number of Afghans, which is on rise and increasing, especially in the city of Kabul. So for now, Afghans looking to leave the country face a limited range of bad options, I have to say. Some shelter in place. The Taliban have been knocking on door to door, as I mentioned, of people knowing who have worked for international NGOs or for US or others, as they wait for the airport to reopen. Others are making the perilous overland journey to Pakistan, Uzbekistan, or Tajikistan. But that's not an option for all at-risk Afghans. And again, we know that the Taliban are controlling all roads to and out of the cities. Women and girls who are actually trying to get out of Afghanistan by land have already reported to us around the number of Taliban checkpoints that exist, as they're making their ways to the borders, either through Torkham in Pakistan or through Mashhad in Iran, that they actually have to bribe and have a lot of cash money with them in order to be able to evacuate by land, in order to actually bribe the Taliban checkpoints as they're moving forward. And again, we're hearing from children in particular who have lost families and guardians and are actually left on their own in the city of Kabul, and they're also trying to evacuate, but they're having no means to do it because either they're too young or they have lost everything that they had, including their family members. So we recognize that it is currently extremely difficult for Afghans also to obtain a visa to a third country or find a way to enter a third country. And they, like many asylum seekers, are facing a significant challenges to fleeing to safety. Immigrant visa applicants who are in third country locations outside of Afghanistan, also we've been hearing that it has been quite difficult to actually approach embassies or consulates or going to the visa centers. They seem that there's a lack of understanding by those staff on the ground in the third countries as to how the Afghan crisis should be handled or how and which groups should be prioritized. So we can see that there's a real challenge not only inside the country but also outside in the neighboring countries. For those that are basically have made it already outside the country, they are having no clarity around where to go next. Even in the transit countries like Pakistan and Iran, they're actually not allowed to stay. A lot of them are already facing deportation. For those women and families that we've been able to actually evacuate to Iran and Pakistan, some of them already were basically pushed, to either be deported or they actually face closed border, and they had no other means than making it into the country through illegal routes. So we need to have a more scalable infrastructure in place in terms of tracking where people are going, making sure that they have third countries to land in and all their paperwork, because this is going to be a problem for as long as the Taliban exists. And I think that's one of the main messages that I have when we talk about, evacuation, we talk about, getting people to safety. So right now, the Kabul airport, which we're talking about, is the Taliban is making negotiation with Qatar and Turkey, ensuring that the airport remains open and commercial flights happen. But to what extent that the Afghans actually have faith and trust for the airport to run commercially and for people to get to places safely is very, very, very nil. People do not have that trust. They're afraid if they get into the airport, they will come across another bomb blast, or maybe the planes will also go through a bomb blast. So there is very poor faith in what the Taliban is promising, because none of their promises has come into any action in the past few weeks, and people are basically living in no hope. Their confidence and courage is gone. So for us as international community also, I think it's quite important to be able to bring that hope and courage and confidence back so that people can survive, so that people can get to a third country for safety and security. Thank you, Fen.
Thank you very much, Najiba. Belkis.
Before I answer the question, Fen, if I could just say a few things about the women's employment that Eileen just mentioned. I think it's important for the international community who meet with the Taliban to remind them that women's employment is not a luxury. Women have to work in order to feed their families, given the economic situation in Afghanistan. And that's something it looks like Taliban are missing or neglecting to understand. And there was also a reference to many Afghans going to Iran and Pakistan. As far as we know, both Iran and Pakistan have closed their borders to Afghans. So the ones who are able to go must have proper travel documentation and visas from those countries. It's not like old days when mass influx of Afghans would go to Iran and Pakistan. So the evacuation so far from Afghanistan has been hailed by the US as a success based on the large number of SIV holders from out of Kabul. But in reality, from a ground perspective, it's not a success because of the vast number of human rights and women's rights defenders and civil society leaders that could not get into the airport during the first few weeks are still left behind. The struggle for Afghans at high risk, and there are many of them, journalists, professional Afghans who worked as judges, lawyers, prosecutors, teachers, university lecturers, and civil society and women's rights defenders. They continue to be at high risk. The Taliban are not allowing Afghans without foreign visas to leave. So that's one aspect of the issue. And the other is that most countries, if I may also mention Canada, that could give foreign visas to Afghans are sitting on their hands. I think we should act fast and we should not lose time. This is the issue of life and death to many Afghans. I would also like to commend Albanian government for proactively stepping forward and offering refugee status or refuge to Afghans, even though it's temporarily. I hope that other countries will follow suit. So the US and other allies that have offered rhetorical assistance to Afghan refugees should do more, as I said before, to facilitate the travel of Afghans out of Afghanistan and to the countries that have promised them refuge. There are many of them, including US, European countries, Canada, and so on. This includes for international community to negotiate with neighboring countries that transit permission be given to Afghans more quickly. and efficiently. Also, it includes facilitating electronic visas. Najiba just mentioned that many Afghans do not have proper travel documentation like passports. The passport office has been closed for the past 1 month. And we understand that the equipments to print passports have been destroyed by the Taliban. So that's not going to be fixed immediately. We ask for foreign countries to understand the difficulties that Afghans are faced now and make exceptions for those without proper passports to travel and take refuge. UNHCR and other UN agencies should be funded adequately. This is the time now to support the tens of thousands of qualified Afghan refugees to live in the host countries. We have issues inside Afghanistan, in the provinces and in Kabul. And then once they migrate or they go to third countries, we have to consider their problems as well. Remember, the banks have been closed for a month, and many Afghans who managed to get out of the country, they could not take extra cash with them to survive for a long period of time in third countries. I also understand that countries have reservations to accept Afghans who have obtained legal status in other countries. Many of them had no other choice but to obtain that, and now they're stateless. Those Afghans need to be supported. And I also would like to call on the US that it should increase its quotas for both SIVs and also refugee visas, given that tens of thousands of qualified Afghans are still in need of evacuation and refugee status. The international community should continue to pressure the Taliban to allow Afghans to leave. Taking people hostage is not how government and governance work. The international community should pressure neighboring countries to open their borders. Pakistan, Uzbekistan, Tajikistan, Iran, they need to show some compassion and open their borders to Afghans who want to leave Afghanistan.
Belkis, I'd like to bring Alp Ozerdem, who has been waiting patiently in on that point. Your observation that many countries are closing their borders. It's not just in the immediate neighborhood, but in the wider region, which is leaving many Afghans, the millions who are already in refugee camps in Pakistan and Iran in a very difficult situation. Resettlement is clearly going to be a major ongoing challenge. We have something called the Global Compact on Refugees, which many countries have signed, which calls for responsibility sharing when it comes to dealing with refugees. Alp, is the Global Compact failing miserably in the case of Afghanistan? And how do we, how does the international community, get countries to step up to the plate? I know that's a tall order.
Thank you, Fan, and I will continue from where Belkis left. And regarding the Global Compact on Refugees and the way the international community has been failing quite miserably. Yes, I mean, I don't want to be kind of the guy who dampens the mood at the party, but I think that's the reality. Let's face it, let's accept it to start with. So I don't think there will be much appetite for relocation from now on. I think we've seen the vast majority of it already taken place in the immediate aftermath of the takeover by the Taliban. So we are, I think, really talking about kind of like if there is that sort of refugee crisis, in the context of host countries, neighboring countries, like as the other panelists mentioned, these are kind of Iran and Pakistan, and if they open their borders. And I think to some extent in this picture, Turkey is a kind of interesting country that I'd like to come back to in a minute because it's kind of provides a different set of dilemmas for the donor community. But I think with the global compact on refugees, the whole idea of a coordinated, predictable, and equitable means of providing support to Afghan refugees. I think in the current environment, at least it really sounds like a lofty ideal, to be honest, because like some of our panelists mentioned earlier, the history in Afghanistan just keeps repeating itself. So I think we've been here before, and I know we know the experience with the international community in dealing with the refugee crisis in relation to Afghanistan. So I'm not expecting anything that's sort of significant coming up out of this. So what might be happening as far as the international community is concerned? Number one, I think the international community would prefer to contain the crisis, either as a kind of a containment within Afghanistan, or if the neighboring countries, Iran and Pakistan, open their borders, and Uzbekistan and Tajikistan, others. So, just looking after refugees in those countries, and I don't think that will be much interest for the relocation of them to European Union, US, or Canada and other Western countries. I think if those Afghans are able to reach Turkey, as has been the case over the last few months, their numbers have increased quite drastically. That would kind of sort of provide a different type of dilemma for the international community, because Turkey borders with 2 European Union countries, Greece and Bulgaria. So then the kind of like that, you cannot contain the crisis. It's just like it becomes an issue for you. So I think the international community would, again, the EU particularly, would like to keep the Afghan refugees in Turkey by providing assistance to the Turkish government. And also, I think one of the main reasons of my pessimism with the relocation issues is that now we are entering fall-winter cycle of the pandemic, COVID pandemic. And I think many governments in the West will be dealing with this particular crisis again. And I think the Afghan refugee crisis won't be in their priority list, unfortunately. So I think that's kind of like the impact of the pandemic on the current crisis in Afghanistan. And lastly, let me just mention that in many Western countries, EU and others, the refugee politics really kind of a hot potato issue. It's almost like the existential matter for many governments in those countries. So with the kind of like the idea of thousands of Afghans being relocated and provided home as refugees, I think that would be really problematic for those countries. So this is why I think I've been very pessimistic. But let me just come back to your question around the global compact on refugees. And let's remember the 4 objectives. One is the pressures on host countries. Number 2 is enhance refugee self-reliance. Number 3, expand access to third country solutions. And finally, support conditions in countries of origin for return in safety and dignity. Well, let me start with the last one. So I think in the current crisis, as we heard from our Afghan colleagues, those people who are fleeing Afghanistan, they are doing so because they're really afraid of their lives because of the Taliban. So, like for them to go back to Afghanistan is not really an option in the near future. In fact, that will take kind of a change of the government to power in Afghanistan if they would entertain this idea. So that's not really an option. When we come back to the whole issue of the possibility of expanding access to third country solution, well, in that, I think we might see some relocation opportunities, in the US, in Canada, and perhaps in the EU. But I think the problem is that, like mentioned by a number of our colleagues, is that there are millions of Afghans who want to leave Afghanistan, but they can't. They simply don't have the resources, and they don't have the money. They don't have passports. They don't have the papers. They cannot get visas. So this whole idea of relocation to a third country and access, it's not going to really happen because I don't see that kind of appetite in the West for making this happen. So what's
Thank you.
let me just Fen, just one more
Wrap
comment,
up. Yep.
if
Thanks.
I may.
Yep.
I think on the issue of like the host countries and the way the kind of like the self-reliance in those countries. So Iran and Pakistan have been taking the main burden of this traditionally, and but those countries, they have their own problems. So and I think kind of this whole idea of enhancing refugee self-reliance will be very difficult in those places. So they may be fleeing Afghanistan for their lives, but then they will be ending up in poverty and the kind of really hard conditions of living. So unfortunately, the picture seems very grim for the Afghan refugee crisis right now.
Well, thank you. And I would, in the time remaining, like to turn to our audience. We do have quite a large audience that has been asking lots of questions. My apologies to the audience. I'm not going to be able to put all of your questions to the panel, but let me start with Diane Rummery, who asked, foreign aid always seems to end up lining the pockets of the most powerful. How can aid be streamlined to the people who are in such terrible straits in this situation? Who'd like to take that question on? And maybe just one of our panelists so we can get more questions.
Maybe if I could quickly answer, add something to that thing.
Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, what's important for us, firstly, is to emphasize that, a global mobilization of financial and human resources right now is urgently needed in Afghanistan. So we need to continue to expand, the funding for humanitarian assistance. And again, I'm talking about ongoing and flexible funding that's needed to respond to immediate humanitarian concerns and supports the efforts of organizations working to assist people displaced within the country and to the neighboring countries. So, and to do that more effectively, I think it's quite important to work with local-led organizations on the ground, especially right now, as many NGOs have left the country, and those that have remained in the country doesn't necessarily have the tools to actually go to remote areas or to be even put themselves at a greater risk where there's a higher presence of the Taliban. So I think the role of the local-led organizations can be quite important. Many of them right now are under-resourced, so it's quite important for us to be able to direct aid to those first responders to the crisis, and working in partnership with the Afghan civilians and ensuring that they are actually involved in any implementation or design or evaluation of any kind of projects that's happening right now in either in emergency mode or as a long term.
Thanks. Thanks very much. Another question, and a number of you touched on this, that part of the difficulty of helping those Afghans who want to leave is that many Western countries, including Canada, have closed their embassies, don't recognize the Taliban government. What would you say to those countries? Should they open their embassies, send their diplomats back, engage, observe? Who would like to take that one on? Because it would mean recognizing the Taliban government. If you're going to open an embassy, it does require recognition. So, Fazia.
Thank you. On the embassies, I think the last leverage left before concrete steps are taken and measures are taken by Taliban, not in terms of generic statements and press releases, but also in terms of action, is a political recognition. Because even in terms of the humanitarian aid, which I know $1 billion was raised yesterday to the UN, now we have to, the other responsibility remains is how to ensure that Taliban will actually let these humanitarian organizations to reach out to communities impartially. and without a political influence, because they are controlling everything. The fear is that they are not actually allowing aids to reach some of these communities. Some of the communities were affected by war even after the Taliban took over. We know that there were a lot of forced migration. Also, people were forced to leave their houses. In Panjshir, for instance, a lot of families actually, we know the situation of human rights in Panjshir Valley. So I think even if humanitarian aids are sent, which I think they should be sent, I think we need to work with them at operation level to ensure that these aids reach to the communities, to the needy people. But it has to also go in an impartial way. A political recognition at this stage, I think, will be kind of putting a verification stamp to what's happening in Afghanistan. And that will surprise a lot of people in Afghanistan, and I guess also your own voters and taxpayers, because I think the Taliban really need to demonstrate. So under clear circumstances, first is the situation of human rights and women's rights, inclusion of ethnic minorities and religious minorities and women's rights meaningfully in the government, women as well. They have promised in Moscow, they promised here, they need to keep that promise. If they do not keep that promise, means they actually were making all those generic statements to demonstrate to the world that they are moderate, to get their agreement signed with the United States. In reality, we see a different face. So therefore, I think we have to deliver. I know that some of even the Taliban members are not happy with what has happened in their own government, the way that they actually appointed people, the way the government was formed. Some of the Taliban are not happy. There were some news also leaked, but in reality, also I know that they are not happy. So I think we have to really use that leverage, because they put the name of the current government, they put caretaker government. So if this is a caretaker government for a short period of time, let's now work for a more permanent government on the principles of restoring the democratic institutions and inclusion, meaningful inclusion. So we have that leverage. We have to use that. The second will be, I think, the association or disassociation of Taliban with some of these military extremist groups. I think Afghanistan has now become safe again for these people to come back. So therefore, I think we have to really monitor the situation. On the basis of these situations only, and also in the evacuation, I think we have to really see how the Taliban collaborate, not only with on the people that are dual citizens or the citizens of different countries, but on the people that are at risk. I know, for instance, a lot of local level politicians and parliamentarians also in Afghanistan that couldn't make it outside Afghanistan. They're still, and to everyone that I talk, they're still in Kabul or in the provinces. So therefore, I think these are like the three measures that we have to see serious actions, serious steps before we actually then go to recognition.
Thanks very much. Alp, I see you put your hand up. Did you want to comment?
Yes, Fan. I think this whole issue around the humanitarian crisis we are facing in Afghanistan and what Eileen described as the perfect storm. Look, I don't think it's really the right place to talk about conditionality, because it's going to only worsen the situation. And this is kind of like, obviously I understand the issues around engaging with the Taliban and what that would mean politically, and the kind of a plethora of the issues around human rights, women's rights, etc. But I think, let's face it, the liberal peace project over the last 20 years failed miserably in Afghanistan. So this whole idea that we should not consider engaging the Taliban, and especially in the current environment where millions of people are facing starvation and food insecurity, I think it's really not the right place to talk about that. I think the conditionality would make matters even worse. Perhaps the distinction between, yes, the humanitarian and development aid could be made, but as we know, that's not the perfect world. Say like water is a relief aid, it's a kind of immediate aid, but water is also developmental aid. So how are you going to make the difference with, between them? So, the issues, I really don't want to be in the Eileen's shoes at the moment, delivering assistance in Afghanistan, because it's really challenging, because it's really kind of like mine with moral dilemmas in many ways. And this whole issue about dealing with the Taliban, engaging the Taliban, from my perspective, we should be a lot more proactive around this, rather than just repeating the mistakes of the past. Because in the when the Taliban was in power in the past, there was so much uncoordinated kind of activity around how to deal with the Taliban, and I don't think we should make the same mistake. Yes, the international community is not just one body. There are lots of different types of actors, and that's actually the advantage we can use. From the bilateral, multilateral, the ICRC, the Red Cross, Red Crescent family, UN family, all that. I mean, diplomacy space is full of opportunities that we can use effectively in engaging with the Taliban in different ways. So in short, what I'm saying is that I think this whole idea of like the conditionality and punishing the Taliban for what they are and not engaging with them would be wrong for Afghan people. If they were legitimate enough to have the negotiations over the peace process, I think they are legitimate enough to deal with the problems and the challenges of Afghan people today.
Well, along those lines, we have an interesting question from one of our panelists or observers. Should the UN Secretary General be encouraged to meet with Taliban leaders in Afghanistan to facilitate the delivery of humanitarian and development assistance to the people of the country? Eileen, would you perhaps like to take that one up, or Nipa?
Sure, I'm happy to. And Nipa, jump in if you like. I think we've seen a number of high-level UN stakeholders engaging in Afghanistan in recent weeks. The Emergency Relief Coordinator, Martin Griffiths, visited Afghanistan last week. Filippo Grandi is there currently, I think. So I think this high-level engagement with the Taliban on ensuring there is humanitarian space and that humanitarian principles are understood and accepted by the Taliban is a critical starting point for us to actually be able to keep the needs of the Afghan people at the forefront of our minds. I think having that level of engagement, particularly when we're looking for nationwide commitments on what humanitarian space should look like and how we as humanitarian partners will be able to deliver a response. What we're seeing currently are differences across the country in terms of how we're able to operate or where decisions are made. And I think having that high level engagement, including as you saw at the conference in Geneva yesterday, where there is engagement at the highest levels on ensuring that there is principled humanitarian action, that there is a joint effort by humanitarian partners, by the diplomatic community, and by the UN on ensuring that this space exists and that we are able to operate in line with those principles is really critical. So I think it's been positive to see that engagement, and it will have to be consistent and ongoing. We've seen some commitments from the Taliban on ensuring humanitarian space and our ability to operate, but what we now need to see is that turn into practical action on the ground. And that will require ongoing engagement at all levels for us to be able to maintain that. And I think while the spotlight is on Afghanistan now, that ongoing diplomacy by the UN, by the international community, and by humanitarian partners will be critical for maintaining the gains and ensuring that those commitments are actually turning into action. Thanks.
Nipa.
Well, I agree with, what's her name? Eileen. I agree with Eileen. All these diplomatic efforts needs to be made. The UN has been quite active, actually, in trying to promote talking to the Taliban. One of the proposals I just saw, I did not look, didn't have the time to look at it very carefully yet, but about peace observation mission in the UN peace observation mission in Afghanistan. I think that's an interesting proposal, and it could be looked at. All of these issues that we have discussed this morning, they could come under that kind of peace observation mission. I'm not saying peacekeeping, but it's a peace observation mission. I mean, unfortunately, we don't have too much time now to discuss this, but it could be done. There were many others also, Fen. I saw questions that came up. It's very difficult to answer all of them, but very interesting questions, and they have good answers, but there's no time now to discuss those.
Yes, I do want to apologize to our very deeply engaged audience on this webinar that unfortunately we are out of time. We're not able to answer all of your excellent questions, but we have had a very good discussion. We've heard that the situation is worsening. It's going to get worse this winter in terms of the humanitarian crisis that many Afghans, both in Afghanistan and also in neighboring countries, are going to be facing. There is a real need for the international community to step up to the plate, to honor the pledges that have been made and to put more money on the table to help the Afghan people. There are obviously real dilemmas when it comes to working with the Taliban government, which often says one thing and does another, especially when it comes to honoring human rights in the country. The borders to Afghanistan are closed. That's creating a problem for those who are trying to leave. Western countries, including Canada, could do a lot more to provide visas to help those Afghans who are trying to get out of the country. But at the end of the day, we are going to have to work with the Taliban, and finding the modalities of that is going to be one of the main challenges for our diplomats and others in the international community who are trying to help the people of Afghanistan. I would like to thank our very distinguished panel for participating in this webinar, for your excellent comments and observations. I wish we had more time, but we're out of time. But the conversation is obviously going to continue, both in forums that the World Refugee and Migration Council and its partners will continue to organize and other venues. So thank you all for a great discussion and some terrific ideas that you've brought forward.